My name is Wayne Beaton and I'm the Director of Open Source Projects here at the Eclipse Foundation. In this video I am going to talk about Eclipse project roles. The Eclipse Foundation Development Process defines multiple roles. Committers, project leads, the Project Management Committee, and the EMO all play important roles. In this video we'll help you understand who is who. The Eclipse Foundation Development Process defines the governance structure for open source development at the Eclipse Foundation. The Eclipse Foundation Development Process describes how we engage in the open source process and provides a framework for project lifecycle management. It also describes many of the rules involved in the execution of open source at the Eclipse Foundation. Project teams make project decisions. Ultimately, committers are in charge and decide what they will work on. This is mostly true as many committers take direction from their employers and so are not entirely left to their own devices. Other stakeholders, including contributors and adopters, have some influence as well, but committers are the ultimate authority. It's natural that some committers will become technical leaders from whom other committers may take direction, but that sort of relationship is informal. In general, Eclipse open source projects are self-organizing and develop methodologies and practices organically. Note that the Eclipse open source projects have no private channels, so everything happens in the open. In the next few slides, I'll talk a bit about each of the roles involved in open source development. Committers are the primary gatekeepers for the project. Committers are the ones who decide what code goes into the repository, what gets included in builds, and what ends up in the open source project's products. Code written by a committer can and should be pushed directly into the project's source code repository. Committers also have a responsibility to work with contributors to help them get merge or pull requests accepted. Committers are the ones who identify contributors who are candidates to become committers. They're the ones who start committer elections and vote in them. You'll sometimes hear us refer to development being done under the supervision of the PMC. We regard this to mean content that has been developed in an open and transparent manner. That is, content that is in scope and in plan. Generally, this means that the content is developed in response to a documented issue or plan item, or is otherwise a natural evolution of the code developed in a manner that allows participation by the community. A committer who spends a few hours developing content before pushing it directly into the project's source code repository is likely working under the supervision of the PMC. A committer who disappears for a few weeks to work on a feature and then drops it into the project repository is not. In the former example, the hypothetical committer is working in a manner that facilitates participation by others. The latter hypothetical committer is not. Contributors are those individuals who, well, contribute to the project. Anybody can be a contributor. To be a contributor, you just need to contribute. Contributions typically take the form of code or documentation submitted to a project's source code repository, but may also take the form of answering questions in project and community forums and more. As a committer, you have some obligations with regards to accepting contributions. You need to ensure that the contributor is covered by the Eclipse Contributor Agreement. This agreement makes sure that we have the necessary rights in place to accept and distribute the contribution. We have systems in place to help you with this. Note that contributions made to an Eclipse project remain the property of the author, or, depending on the nature of the relationship between the author and their employer. So a committer's work remains the property of the committer and a contributor's work remains the property of the contributor. An Eclipse open source project generally has one or two project leads. The role of project lead is one of responsibility, not privilege or prestige. Project leads are the first link in the project leadership chain and the primary liaison between the project team and the Eclipse Management Organization, or EMO. The EMO will, for example, ensure that the project leads are looped in all matters regarding the project governance. In cases where public channels should not be used, for example, in the case where the security team receives a vulnerability report, the project lead is the first point of contact. More generally, the project lead has a responsibility to ensure that the project committers understand the open source process and are able to successfully implement the Eclipse Foundation Development Process. The project lead can reach out to the next rung in project leadership chain or the EMO for assistance. Eclipse projects must engage in periodic reviews. These reviews may be initiated by the EMO or can be initiated by any committer. Whatever the case, the EMO will reach out to the project leads to ensure that they are aware that the review is in progress and ensure that they are engaged in the event that a review reveals issues that require mitigation. Project leads have the ability to retire committers. This is a power that must be used responsibly. The project lead needs to be able to support their decision to retire a committer. As a best practice, the project lead should give committers reasonable opportunity to retain their status and, should the decision be made to retire, committer retirements should be announced on the project's mailing list. The project lead is not the technical lead, so it's not strictly their responsibility to develop things like coding standards, project policies, and such. They are responsible for, however, for making sure that those sorts of things do get created and for making sure that the project team is working to complete shared goals. We have no formal designation of project lead. This tends to occur organically. All Eclipse projects are organized hierarchically with a top-level project at the root. A project management committee, or PMC, is responsible for the operation of the top-level project and all of the projects that are nested inside the top-level project. A PMC has one or more PMC leads and some number of PMC members. PMCs vary in size and composition depending on the goals and the values of the top-level project as captured in the top-level project's charter. While the actual size varies from PMC to PMC, a PMC of 5 or 6 members is the norm. PMC leads are appointed by the Eclipse Foundation's Board of Directors on recommendation from the Eclipse Foundation's Executive Director, who works with the EMO and stakeholders to identify candidates. PMC members are appointed by the Eclipse Foundation's Executive Director. Together, the PMC provides oversight and overall leadership for the projects that fall under their top-level project. The PMC's role is, fundamentally, to maintain the overall vision and operation of the top-level project and all of the projects that fall within its purview. Very often, though it really depends on the nature of the top-level project, the PMC will take a very active role in determining how its projects fit together and how they communicate and interoperate. The PMC ensures that projects are following the rules. The PMC may set standard requirements for releases or set expectations regarding what constitutes a reasonable demonstration of merit in committer elections. PMCs may set coding styles and other technical standards, but most PMCs leave that level of detail to the individual project teams. The EMO leans heavily on the PMC to take a leadership role in the project governance. The PMC decides what projects for which it will accept responsibility. The PMC should expect to review project proposals to determine whether or not a proposed project fits with the overall mission and scope of the top-level project. The PMC is called on to assist with the intellectual property due diligence process. Primarily, the EMO looks to the PMC for general knowledge of the technical spaces occupied by the projects operating under their purview and seeks their advice when investigating content from unfamiliar technical areas. Note that the Eclipse Foundation's IP team are not coders and don't necessarily understand the technologies that they review while they're doing their investigations. When a committer or project lead election completes successfully, the PMC is called upon to approve the election. The PMC's role is to ensure that the open source rules of engagement have been followed in the election and that the election was run in a vendor neutral manner. The EMO seeks the advice of the PMC regarding whether or not projects under its purview are operating according to the open source rules of engagement. That is, the EMO expects that the PMC has some insight into the operation of the projects operating under their purview. They know whether or not project teams have what they need to be successful. In rare cases where a grievance cannot be resolved within a project, the PMC will work with the EMO to find a resolution. The EMO is a team of Eclipse Foundation staff members who are focused on helping open source projects be successful. The team is comprised of an open source project governance team and an intellectual property team. The EMO Open Source Project Governance Team provides services to the projects, facilitates project reviews, helps project leads and PMCs resolve grievances, and more. The EMO's intellectual property team ensures that the content contained in Eclipse project repositories and third-party content referenced by Eclipse project content are consistent from a licensing and copyright perspective. The intellectual property team also provides trademark services for the Eclipse Foundation and the Eclipse open source projects. The EMO is the primary player in our implementation of the Eclipse Foundation Development Process. The best method of contact with the EMO is by email at emo@eclipse-foundation.org. If you have a question that cannot be answered by the project lead, your mentor, or the PMC, ask the EMO. Where can you get help? The incubation mailing list requires subscription. The list is public and has a public archive. This list is generally low volume and is monitored by a lot of folks who have a lot of experience with the Eclipse Foundation development process. You are most likely to get a timely response here. Depending on the maturity of your project, you can have a lot of your questions answered by your project lead. Use your project's development list to connect so that your entire team can benefit from the answers to your questions. The EMO inbox is monitored during regular Eastern Zone business hours. The EMO is usually able to respond to your queries in 48 hours. Especially if you have questions or issues with regard to project infrastructure, connect with the Eclipse Foundation's IT staff by opening a help desk issue. All of these links are provided on the committer training page and in the Eclipse Foundation project handbook.